everybody. All right, I think I know everybody here, so I don't have to tell you who I am, but hey. But for Zoom, just in case, I'm Dan Boscavel, and I'm an assistant professor of philosophy in Pratt's Department of Social Science and Cultural Studies, and it's my pleasure to facilitate this year's Critical and Visual Studies Symposium. The course, for those of you who aren't in it, is structured around presentations by SSCS faculty and distinguished guests on general themes that change year by year. And this year's theme is Songs is Dark, a title based on the Brecht poem motto, which is right here. In this course, we're confronting the question of how, as thinkers, artists, and activists, we should relate to the darkness of our times and how we might help to illuminate it. So today we're fortunate to have Sarah Aziza here to think these questions with us. Sarah is a Palestinian American writer with roots in Deir, al-Balah, Gaza. She asks you to do your part in the struggle to liberate Palestine and all people. Her award-winning journalism, poetry, and essays, and creative fiction, nonfiction, have appeared in the New Yorker, the Baffler, Harper's, Mizna, the Washington Post, the Intercept, and the Nation, among others. She has received residencies and fellowships from Fulbright, the Tin House Writers Workshop, the Asian American Writers Workshop, Cafe Royal Society, and the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. Her first book, The Hollow Half, is a work of experimental memoir exploring the intertwined legacies of diaspora, colonialism, and the American dream that will be published in April 2025, and I'm sure it's going to be awesome, and I can't wait. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Aziza. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, wow. I always forget there's going to be a bio. I get a little self-conscious. Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm Sada, and I'm excited to think through these questions with you all today. I think I have a good amount of notes, and I think I'm going to read a little and sort of freestyle a little bit, and then I hope we can have a good discussion afterwards. Some of you may have taken a look at a couple pieces that I shared with Dan. I'm not gonna be redundant. So if you read it, that's great. I'm gonna talk, next to those things I shared in those pieces. If you haven't read it, I'm just gonna share some other thoughts, because the question of art and writing and representation in a year of genocide is an ongoing question for me. It's been very progressive. I've had different thoughts at different points. So I'm going to do maybe a little bit of a summary of some of the arc of my thinking and share at the end sort of where I'm at right now as far as the ethic and the aesthetic around what I'm trying to do today on day 383 of genocide. I'm going to just jump in and we'll talk. I sit here today as a writer, an artist, a Palestinian, and on day 383 of the genocide of my people, I ask myself what could possibly be the purpose of speech. What can be uttered is insufficient. Uttering is insufficient. Yet I will offer some reflections, nonetheless, about the last year of horror and witness. I know some of you, I'm going to jump down, sorry. I will begin with an image. A bulldozer rams into a fence cordoning off the Gaza Strip, and bodies rush through the aperture. Off camera, a horseman screams in Arabic, "Break it, God is great, break it." For an instant, Gaza no longer means unreachable, trapped, inert. All my life, the name Gaza has been an ache, beloved and impenetrable, intimate and out of reach. It is a land where my father was born as a refugee and a place he loved despite the larger tragedy that stranded his family there. I'm speaking of the Nakba. Gaza, a place where he was born, that was born to me the first time he told me the stories of the sea. As a 6-year-old, he used to sneak in swims in the Mediterranean on the way home from school, splashing naked in the water until his brother arrived to haul him back. I see Gaza return in his eyes each time he glimpses waves. Gaza is also the place my father watched my grandmother dig a trench as the Six-Day War of 1967 approached. He did not understand the ditches until the planes ripped overhead. And for a lifetime, I have mourned the family members held captive there, their lives more desperate with each passing year of siege that began in 2007. I've held my breath with them through 4 wars, their bodies trapped under falling skies, sealed off from all escape. Their slaughter so routine, Israel calls it mowing the lawn. My family and 2 million others caged by a nuclear power that refers to them as weeds. I often despaired that I would ever see them free. Yet for an instant, watching those bodies running under the sun, it seems absurdly simple. A wall is just a wall. So I'll ask you just to hold on to that image. I know we're in critical visual studies, so sharing that image and how that image sort of was seared in the world consciousness after that day. But as the radio continued to broadcast the news, telling me Palestinian fighters breached the Israeli barriers, I waited for the inevitable follow-up that these would-be guerrillas were killed, as is the fate of most Palestinians who rebel. A strange sensation took over me then. My eyesight blurred, a sense of my body slicing itself in half, sliding apart. My body knew already what was beyond my ability yet to grasp, that one history had ended and we were falling, already bloody, into the next. So I entered that season of genocide as a writer and a Palestinian and began to reckon with the question of representation and writing and struggle. So I'm going to jump forward a little bit in my reflections. Through the chilling autumn, time moved like an accordion. Interminable nights and bitter bright mornings, weekends compressed with urgency. I burned with an electric grief, my veins timed to the hammer pulse of war. With millions around the world, I read our death, wrote our death, protested our death, measuring each hour in corpses, in outrage, in fear. I was publishing as much as I could. I was in the streets. I was organizing. It felt like speaking out was the most important thing we could do, and making plain the atrocities and the just lightning quick momentum with which we were throttling towards just like utter catastrophe. So at the beginning, as a writer, as a Palestinian, I thought speaking and bearing with an AR and then an EAR, just bearing witness to what was going on was the most important thing I could do. So that's where I stood in the first quarter. Like so many others, the first quarter of this last year, I mean. Like so many others, I followed the fearless journalists in Gaza as they raced over and over again toward the epicenter of their own slaughter. Phones first, to capture footage of what should have never been possible to see. My imagination was demolished and remade time after time, making way for ever more staggering atrocities. By day 26, the United Nations declared that Gaza was running out of time. Their report decried the ongoing Israeli strikes on Jabalia refugee camp as a war crime, day 26. If you've been following the news, Jabalia is also what we're decrying now. At the time, it was still a shock to see the dense neighborhood blocks blasted into rubble, craters sinking like punctured lungs. But already the Zionist state had dropped the equivalent of 2 nuclear bombs on Gaza, devastating hospitals, utilities, and universities. It had already declared siege on all life-sustaining resources, including electricity and food. It had ordered more than 1 million Palestinians out of their home, killed at least 9,000, and wounded at least 23,000 more. Today, in the 13th month of genocide, it is difficult for me to grasp that a mere year ago, I did not know the shape that flesh takes under the tread of a tank. Once, I did not begin my days checking for massacres and did not fall asleep, saying both silent prayers and goodbyes. Bewildering to think I lived a whole life before I saw the crushed skull of a Palestinian child. Back then, I had not yet stared into the face of a lifeless girl, the single bullet hole in her forehead indicting the moral order of our world. This is not to say I was innocent. The daughter of a Gazan refugee, as I've already mentioned, I've always known the place my people have been granted inside this current world order. I grew up loving and living among generations of our displaced relatives in Saudi Arabia and Jordan, our home spectral with the present absence of Palestine. And I spent the years 2020 to 2023 researching the Nakba, painstakingly recording family memories of the catastrophe as part of my first book. I made visits to the occupied land and lived my days in the tension of diaspora and return deferred. But for the past year, we have witnessed the Nakba's return, the catastrophe of massacre, displacement, and erasure of Palestinian life and culture. Now the chronology of global failure, moral failure thrums through me, ongoing and simultaneously. Each gesture is shadowed by its parallel impossibility. I lift a cup to my lips and know that others can count the days, weeks, months since their last taste of clean water. I bathe and remember another cousin who returned to his home in northern Gaza after weeks living outdoors, desperate to take a shower. The bomb found him in the bathtub. He was 15. It is not only me. I trust that many of us have found our screens transformed into portals of horror. From our beds or chairs, walking to work or to meet friends, we may witness entire families obliterated under rubble, reduced to sacks of shredded flesh, or literally vaporized. We hear story after story from one or another of the 10,000 Palestinian prisoners taken by Israel, learning of widespread sexual abuse and torture there. On another day, we watch a clip in which Israelis publicly defend rape as an instrument of war. The atrocities not only touch our present, but our future too. What is to become of the WCNSF, the Wounded Child No Surviving Family, a horrific new acronym that emerged over the past year? And while conditions have slowed the official counting of the dead, experts predicted in July that if the war ended immediately, the combined effects of violence, displacement, deprivation, and disease might still claim over 500,000 lives. Pause, breathe. I ask myself again, what do I say to all of this? Did you, listening to this litany I just shared, recognize each number and adjective? Or did you struggle to resist tuning out? After all, I did admit that what I came to say to you today was unthinkable. Unthinkable. For months, I have reached for words and found them curdling inside out. Everything is unthinkable, unspeakable, incomprehensible, flailing gestures, all we have in the face of such obscenity. The crisis of language recurs daily, is endemic. But when we say these events are unthinkable, we must answer, unthinkable to whom? When I tell my cousin Nabil, who after losing friends, career, and family, just lost his home too, I can't imagine how you must feel. I am telling a truth, yet I am not absolved. Where my words in any language tremble, his body is a stone-cold certainty. So I've been forced, like many of us probably, to admit that language alone cannot stop genocide. The last year has shown us this undeniably, underscoring the extent to which imperialist, capitalist hegemons will contradict every proclaimed moral to advance its material aims. Language alone cannot stop genocide, not without sustained, tangible resistance. Every one of us, artists or not, owes something to that front, the front of tangible material resistance. But if language alone cannot save the living, then perhaps we should also think what we owe to the dead. For the past year, as some of you may have glanced at, I've been writing letters to the poet George Abraham. And one of the things we've been thinking together about is what does it mean to carry our slain, our dead with us while we live and breathe? What does it mean to have a Palestinian body alive in a time of death? For me, it means disrupting peace. It means offending liberal sensibilities. It means transgressing the artificial border erected between the horrors in Gaza and our contrived safety in the metropole. And it means, as numbing as it may be, as futile as it may feel, it means we must not look away. We must not relent in recording the Zionist crimes there, however imperfect and partial our records inevitably remain. We must record, because to consign ourselves to incoherence is to forfeit a large measure of the ethical distance which separates us from those who accept or even cheer on genocide. It would mean to abandon our dead. Or to quote the Palestinian poet Fadi Judah, the dead don't grieve or sing, not without the living, they don't. So I did write about 6 months ago about how the efforts to record the atrocities were starting to feel futile. I'm not here to contradict that. I'm actually here to say that we need to reckon with the limitations, as I just mentioned, that genocide cannot be stopped by language, but at the same time, we should not stop keeping account. I want to recognize that there's like a paradox and a tension there, but I'm going to claim both sides in this. It's all of it. I'm getting close to the end of my remarks, but I'm going to continue to talk at you for a moment. Again, to consign ourselves to incoherence, i.e. to stop recording the atrocities, is to forfeit a large measure of the ethical distance which separates us from those who accept or even cheer genocide. It means to abandon our dead. And again, to quote Judah, the dead do not grieve or sing, not without the living, they don't. But if we are to focus more intently on this duty to record and speak for, speak with, speak of the dead, we must ask ourselves what the most ethical way to do this might be. Just as we must resist the natural desensitization that we feel in the face of mass atrocity, we must also work as writers, as artists, as thinkers, we must also work to avoid its thoughtless reproduction in our work. In an age of mass graves, which threaten to reduce the dead to a jumble of nameless bones, we must remain vigilant, defending the specificity of each affected life. The writer and educator, Rifat al-Arir, who was deliberately assassinated by Israel in December of last year, was emblematic of this ethical position. Years before this current genocide, he founded the NGO We Are Not Numbers, in an effort to help scores of young writers in Gaza hone the skills to tell their own story. He believed in the power of particularity, of the irreducible uniqueness of a single life. And anytime that I'm feeling ethically lost or hopeless, I look to the people of Gaza. Because if they haven't relented in telling their story, if they believe in the power of keeping these scores and defending the irreducibility of each individual life, who am I to give up on that principle? So to be clear, when we say we are not numbers, when we talk about telling our own stories, I'm not talking about the liberal project of self-humanization, of proving oneself human. No person should be made to argue for their right to live. The very idea that such a thing is debatable is a death in itself. But what I'm talking about instead is a principle I want to leave you with, which I take from the Palestinian poet and writer Marid al-Barghouti. Like us, he watched catastrophe overtake Palestine quickly and slowly, day in and day out. He was born in 1944, meaning his life encompassed both the Nekba and the Naksa, or the setback in 1967. The occupation banished him from his home in the West Bank, in what became called the West Bank, banished him for over 20 years from his homeland. And when he returned much later in life, he was shocked to encounter Israel's new apartheid wall. I'm assuming you all know what that wall looks like. He had not seen it. He had not been back home for years, and he came home and found his home utterly altered. And I want to read you a little excerpt of one of his memoirs. It's called I Was Born There, I Was Born Here. And I'm going to read you a bit from this, and then I'm going to extract a little principle that's been helping me think about writing in this hour. So this book was written, I believe, in 2005. Let me see, where do I want to start? Okay. So he's in a car. He's actually being smuggled in an ambulance through the West Bank. And he said, the car stops, and he says, no hand has throttled me, but I feel as though, no hand has throttled me, but I feel as though a hand had throttled me. It's the wall. The wall, which separates Jerusalem from Ramallah and from all the lands of the bank. The wall wasn't here last time. No news bulletin, statement of condemnation, official data as to its length, breadth, and height, or even photograph or television image can convey its ugliness when seen by the eye. It's enough to see a person, any person of flesh and blood, walking next to the wall to feel upset. That person doesn't have to be Palestinian, tired, wounded, an old man, a child, or in any way distressed to feel upset. Just seeing a person and this wall in the same frame is enough to send a shudder down one's spine. It's enough to see a cat prancing in its shadow, or a nearby tree moved by the breeze, or an empty can discarded at its foot to feel that nature, the air, winds, plants, weather, has been subjected to a cruel and disfiguring intervention. A thing of cement that winds its way among the houses, topped by army towers at irregular intervals. Reports, articles, speeches by politicians and campaigners for solidarity with the Palestinian people all speak of its disfigurement of the land. What I see over and above that, though, is the disfigurement of the sky. Yes, this wall disfigures the sky itself. It disfigures the clouds that pass over it. It disfigures the rain that falls upon it. It disfigures the moonlight that touches it and the rays of sun that fall next to it. The issue, however, certainly isn't only one of aesthetics. The wall is surrounded by lies, some of which have been passed off on our worthless media, which repeats itself idiotically. Lies such that the wall is a security wall. The wall has nothing to do with security. On the contrary, it is the wall of great historic theft, the theft of more land and trees and water, the wall of the displacement of Palestinians following the exhaustion of their resources through their separation from their lands, crops, and water basins. This wall puts houses in prison. Prisons the world over are designed for individual criminals who unjustly or justly have been found guilty. This wall has been designed to imprison an entire human community, to imprison a morning greeting between neighbors, to imprison a grandfather's dancing at his grandson's wedding, to imprison the handshakes exchanged at a ceremony of mourning for the death of a relative, to imprison the hand of a mother and prevent it from holding her daughters when she gives birth, to separate the olive tree from the one who planted it, the student from his school, the patient from his doctor, the believer from his prayers at the mosque. It imprisons dates between teenagers. The wall makes you long for colors. It makes you feel that you are living in a strange set, not in real life. It imprisons time inside place. The wall is a word that has no definition except in the dictionary of death. It is the fear felt by our children and the fear felt by the other state. For the wall is the fear of both sides. That is what makes it so satanic. In this moment of sorrow of mine, I see this wall as strange and immortal. And then he finishes, well, he doesn't finish, but I'm going to stop with this line. International resolutions, court cases, the voices of Israeli peace activists and of Israelis who believe in the right of the Palestinian people to freedom and self-determination will never bring this wall down. It was a slightly extended passage, and it's kind of heavy, but I'm not going to leave you just there. But I wanted to share that and highlight the astonishment, the visceral recoiling in Barghouti's body at the sight of the wall. If you recall, he's invoking nature, he's invoking the sky. He's saying that just to see a can on the ground next to that wall, there's just this like very granular sense of the initial shock of seeing that wall. And I argue that we must take from Barghouti's shock, that should be an ethical position for us. To every time we encounter the wall, whatever that wall may be in our current moment in history, the wall should make us recoil. It should be enough to see a can thrown on the street next to the wall, or a cat prancing next to the wall to understand the utter abomination, really, the utter aberration that is oppression against the nature, our nature as human beings, and the earth itself. We must do this. We must have this astonishment because our kernel of resistance will be found here. Our shock is a root for resistance. Because the line that Murid finishes with is this. He says, in this moment of sorrow of mine, I see this wall as strong and immortal. But he also says, at the same time, I am confident that it will disappear one day. This wall will be demolished by our refusal to become used to it. It will be demolished by our astonishment at its existence. So that astonishment, like I said, that astonishment is where I'm trying to hold myself now. After 13 months of genocide, to continue to be astonished, to continue to remember, like I said, that I was once the person that didn't see dead children every day. I was once the person, like Morid, like there was a time before this wall, and we need to hold to the parts of us that either actually lived a different reality or deeply viscerally knows that the reality that is most natural is not the one that we are currently in. And I argue that this astonishment is the vein that runs between our past and future, a channel flowing from what some will call humanity, but which I will call nature. And we must continue to find ways to tap into it. And I think art is a really important piece of that, or can be a really important tool. We must continue to tap into astonishment and shock. It's the knowledge of the earth and the sky, which are no respecters of walls. Our art and our work and our thinking must strive against normalcy. We must permit neither the staggering cruelty of war nor the insidious violence of daily hegemony, the dailiness of hegemony, to become anything less than an affront. And I argue that that is something that Gazans also really exemplify for us. There's no one in Gaza that thinks this is normal. And I just think that astonishment, I'm like sort of like going off my notes now, and just kind of winding down to say that like astonishment is where I think some really important work remains for us. I think that all of the other things I mentioned, whether it's recording and speaking out, whether it's telling individual stories or amplifying other people's stories or fighting in the streets or fighting in legislation or whatever your fight might be, I think that being on guard against any sense of normalcy is my front line right now. So I think that's the kernel of what I wanted to share with you. I hope that was coherent, and I would love to talk about it. Thank you.
All right, so we'll just open it up then. There's a lot here.
I have a question. Well, first, thank you so much for sharing. I'm really curious how that sense of astonishment makes its way into your language.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel like it was like, did the language reveal that to you, and then you're like, oh, this is the place that I want to be in? Or was it intentionally so that you were seeking to stay in that astonishment?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's the latter. Like everybody, I struggle against like a feeling of impotence, a feeling that, language always fails, especially right now, that, I felt so redundant. I felt like the first time I wrote something when the genocide started was October 15th last year, and I thought, oh my God, this is really important. This needs to be said because some of us see where this could go, and we've got to warn folks because maybe that will change. And then, like I said, there was one time where seeing entire city blocks obliterated was just naturally a shock. And it's incredibly tragic and outrageous that we have a whole new visual vernacular now, and literal vernacular, I feel, and so many of the words, at least in English, that we're using are these negations, like incomprehensible, unthinkable, and that is only gesturing at the fact that our language is failing. So, but I don't want to just stop there because that feels like a little bit of a capitulation. I feel like there's like this tension. I have like no good single answer whatsoever, but that's why I said like I continue to take different positions or try different things out in language, because I just know that stagnation is not an option, and that's like such a dangerous place, stagnation or numbing. So Barghuti's words jarred me, and I think they jarred me towards this like thinking around astonishment that I'll talk about, like how I try to bring that into language in a minute. But I think the reason that he jarred me so much was because he's talking about the wall, And I grew up with the wall, so like the idea, like his astonishment at its existence convicted me, because I've never felt that astonished. I felt horror, but I haven't felt astonishment, because I didn't have his frame of reference of like most of his life was lived without the wall. And so it just really, got me thinking of, my frame is so small, and like I kind of like is also talking about at the very beginning how Gaza always felt out of reach for me, because I also, around the same time the wall was built was around the same time I started to become conscious, and the siege in Gaza was underway. So Gaza was always this place that I didn't even ever really think I would go to. It was only the last few years that my family and I were really talking about, because I was born in the US, and it's almost impossible to get to Gaza, and American passports actually work against you a lot of time if you're a Palestinian American. So I continue to grieve the fact that there was so much I wasn't astonished about before this. I accepted like, maybe someday, inshallah, I will see Gaza. Maybe someday. It was just so hard to imagine the wall coming down. So I continually try to, it sounds odd to say, but like almost cause myself pain in my language. That's how I stay alive. Like ethically where I want to be is like I should be. And there needs to be like a practice of community and care and support around that. But actually an essay that I wish I had shared instead of my own work is this essay by Fargo Nassim that some of you may have come across. It's called Craft in the Age of Genocide, I believe. And he talks about, it's a great essay based on a talk he gave. And he talks about how the idea of craft and good writing is actually usually a disciplinary sort of like concept. And we need to be very suspicious of how we write and how we've been taught to write. And he says something along the lines of no one should get out of our writing unscathed. Like basically we should be, our art, as long as genocide is going on, our art should be painful, it should be beyond provocative. It should, if we're gonna spend any time writing while bombs are falling, like it better be dangerous, and it better be affecting. So yeah, I try and make sure that my writing hurts, which sucks. But it's the least that we can do while our bodies are safe, and so many aren't. If that makes sense. Thanks for that question.
I have a couple that while people are thinking. So in the like exchange of letters that you shared, which is beautiful, and I think like really helpful for us in various ways, because we've been thinking about sort of different forms of writing, including like more kind of like personal stuff like that. You have a sort of extended meditation on the phrase repetition is a memoir.
Yeah.
And I just was sort of thinking a little bit about how that might relate to this ethical principle that you're trying to put forward about like trying to remain astonished and to like hold on to the particularity of each individual life. Because it seems to me that like a conscious part of the strategy that Israel employs is that sort of repetition where like you mentioned it's like Jabalaya is bombed and then it's bombed again, and at a certain point like you're like wait, when did this happen? Is this like you know what I mean? You start to kind of just like lose the particularity of it. So I'd just be interested to hear you say a little bit more about if you think that there are sort of like counter strategies for that that you've found are helpful.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I think that a lot of us are struggling with that. Yeah, George and I started writing those, I instigated those letters actually in September of 2023. And it started with a phone call. And I mean, if you did read it, you know, we're talking about like, as artists, I was frustrated before the genocide started when so many of us are members of some community that's under threat or faces violence or erasure or some form of oppression, and there's like this struggle of the moral imperative to represent or defend or talk about something that's affecting people that we love or belong to, and at the same time just also wanting to have a subjectivity separate from that and wanting to write it. I mean, I was literally sitting with a Lebanese friend of mine yesterday who's also a writer, and we were just talking like, what would we write about if our families weren't being killed? Like, what would it be? You know, it's hard to even ask that question, but we were trying to ask that question before the genocide, and just talking about how everything seems to always, you know, drag back to that. There's no real, like, and it's not that we want to disavow it, it's that we don't want to disavow it. We want it to end, and just that struggle. So repetition is a Nakba was sort of a line that George raised in our phone call, and then I used it to open our letter. And it is a question that we continue to wrestle with, and I guess I would say a few things. Again, I always take my cues from the people that are most directly affected. So in this case, it's the people in Gaza. They say the names of the people that are being lost. They write them down. They share the stories. And so I guess on the most basic level, I would say I continue to read the names. I continue to try and follow what's happening. It's not actually that hard for me to, I guess, like feel the impact of each individual just because they're literally my family. But at the same time, I think that what I struggle with is less like the flattening of the people in Gaza and like the seeing them all as the same, and the more of just like the feelings of futility that come with it. But either way, repetition is a Nakba is true. So I guess it just comes back to disrupting it. I know I'm speaking in very abstract terms, but like, I mean, there's literally no good answer to any of the things I'm bringing up today. That's kind of like what I was getting at, is like I'm going to say 5 different things that are parallel to each other, and none of them are the whole answer. I would say there's a lot of asking that question in our community. Like, what do we do when this repetition doesn't end? And I guess, again, we'll just gesture to the people in Gaza and say, like, somehow they continue, and there's something in each one of us that is deeply individual that like ties us to our own life. And I guess just witnessing that, like witnessing the mother who's lost 3 children, or carrying, you know, her elderly father, you know, like she knows that she's not just a number, and she knows that this day and this pain is unique to the one that preceded it. And sometimes it's all that I can do to take in one story in a day, but I think that that's sort of the antidote, is to take in a single story. And sometimes I mean, most of us probably heard the name Shaban el-Dalua in the last week. And my brain is still broken from that story, as you can tell, because I'm sort of like rambling right now. But that image of a person hooked to an IV, being incinerated. I'm sorry, I probably should have like offered a trigger warning at the beginning of this talk, but I think we all knew where we were getting ourselves into. So images like that, like, just puncture the numbness and stay with us a long time. And unfortunately, as long as we don't look away, I think it will continue to happen to us. That there will be those moments where even if we can't seem to break through the deja vu of the Nakba, if we're continuing to be in touch at all with ourselves, I think it's our own individual like subjectivity that will eventually like connect with another's, and I have some faith in that. I'm sorry that was extremely rambling, and I will add one other thing, that there's an account on Instagram that I should look up the handle, I forget it. But I just forget because I look at it and I follow it, but he is a Palestinian who picks one picture every day and writes just a text description of it. His position is that the images are losing their power, and that the meditative act of just transcribing one image into a small paragraph every day is his resistance to that numbingness of the repetition that is the Nakba. And he sends them to me, he DMs them to me a lot, and he's really right about something. There's something there, at least for me, and I can only imagine for him. So yeah, I think again, just if we're thinking about the art and the work that we want to make, I think that the first thing to do is think ethically how we're navigating as individuals through this time. And I think the art grows out of that. And I'm sure he does that first and foremost for his own humanity, and then it's just an offering. And I know it's very affecting for me too. I can share that account when I look it up later if anyone's
That'd be
interested.
great, I'll post it on.
Yeah, I'll share Fargo's essay. I can share like anything else we talk about. Again, sorry I'm rambling. My brain is literally broken since last week, so yeah.
A lot of us are there.
Yeah, I figured it was among
Yeah.
friends.
Do you have some other questions?
Yeah, I do have one, but it's like almost like we have mentioned a little bit on that. My question was based on like how the social media was constructed based on kind of like capitalist
Yeah.
driven. So there's a way of like those pictures was being consumed and
Yeah.
even like words were being consumed.
Yeah.
Like how do we like as like a writer, as a journalist, trying to like cap and holding those vulnerable experience and trying to deliver it to the audience.
Yeah.
It's like the challenge we are
Yeah.
like currently facing. And I was like a bit wondering like what kind of effort could we like do when we are like writing it and or when we are witnessing it? Is there like a way of like approaching to that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've thought about it so much in the last year. I was telling Dan, I like started to make a PowerPoint to just go along with my talk, and then I realized like my feelings around like the images, like picking images, I was like, okay, any image I would pick would be like its own lecture. I'm just not gonna do images right now. Y'all have seen them, you know them, but it's a really important question. I especially thought about the most in the first 6 months because they were like images that we hadn't seen yet. Like I feel like now we've seen so many of them, so I do use images less now because of that. But in the beginning also, like it was like the day 2 or something of the assault in Gaza, I posted, not to be self-referential, but my first instinct was to post this picture, this like black and white photo of my dad as a 4-year-old refugee, a 3-year-old refugee in Gaza, barefoot, like raggedy clothes, like, you know, just to like remind people like this is who you're gonna be bombing. You're cheering for the bombs to fall on people like this. Gaza is over 1 million children. And then I was instantly disgusted with myself, like having it, like, you know, I had accepted the moral premise that I just talked about earlier of like that we could argue for our humanity and like somehow save our own lives by proving ourselves to be as human as they are. So then I just decided to redact his face, and I like post a picture of his face like redacted as a way of questioning like what seeing his face would do, right? Like if you saw that this little boy was adorable, would that suddenly enlighten you that like children shouldn't be killed? Did you not know that before you saw his face? Like do you not have that like the imaginative, intellectual, ethical like ability to know that without this picture? So the very beginning I was like extremely against sharing all these photos, which not everybody had the same position. And I again wrestled with the fact that Gazans themselves wanted those images shared. So that's my tension. It's like, I don't really care what I do. I mean, like I talk to my peers here in the West, like they all have different positions, but I really care what people in Gaza want, and they want their images shown generally. So I do try to be thoughtful. I do try to make sure there's like to what extent we can, and it's really impossible most of the time, but is there consent in some way around these images? Like, does it look like this person knows they're being photographed or recorded? Because these are like the most intimate and raw moments probably any human can imagine. So I don't want to just feel like A, I am entitled to use that, or B, like encourage anyone else to feel entitled to that. I want, like, my piece in Jewish Currents called The Work of the Witness was about the audience. It was like all about the audience. It was like, I talked about how at the beginning we thought, and you could watch, like, you know, y'all remember Palestia and Bisan, and everyone was, you know, following them, and they were heroes, and they were, like I said, running for phone first towards all of these things because they thought, like, oh, the world just needs to see this and it'll stop. And once we realized that wasn't going to stop it, I think the ethical questions changed. And now the record stands because of the moral imperative to record it, and less because we think it's going to stop anything. I think that we need to really, this is the last thing I'll say because I don't want to ramble, but so now I think about what sharing these images will do, because there's not anything that we need to see ever again. Like in January I wrote, like, if you never saw another photo, the work would still be clear what we should do and what's right and what's wrong, I argue. And yet, so there's still the record, we want to still keep the record. But now if we share those images, I want it to be alongside an assertion of Palestinian agency. So there should never be a story that's solely look at the horrible things that Israel is doing to Palestinians. It should be, yes, Zionism is a supremacist, violent ideology that's doing this, and that's not the sum total of the Palestinian existence or even its experience right now. During a genocide, there is resistance, and during a genocide, there is resilience, which is a very loaded word, but basically, I try to make sure that I'm seeking out not just the atrocities, but also the beauty. There's still beauty in Gaza. There's still life in Gaza. There's still babies being born and weddings being had, and there's still resistance. And I think that our ethical position solidarity can only be solidarity if it extends all to the whole spectrum of Palestinian life. And again, that includes resistance. And that's a lot harder pill for people to swallow in the West sometimes than we're against killing babies, which was, we had to drag people there, get people to be against killing babies, and that's important, but the rest of the spectrum of Palestinian life should be on display too, and that's kind of how I would make some kind of peace with those images of atrocities too. So I hope that's some helpful thoughts. Thank you for that question.
Sure.
I have one more question.
Yeah, please.
You were speaking earlier about like the duty to language our dead,
Mm-hmm.
and that the dead need us to grieve them and remember them. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on practices of faith and mourning in relation to like smooth.
Yeah.
Pronouncing that.
Yeah, you're great.
Steadfastness.
Yeah,
resistance.
yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question about faith and grieving and mourning. I think that, first of all, everyone knows that not all Palestinians are Muslim, but the majority in Gaza are Muslim. So we've seen a lot of Muslim funerals on social media or on the news or on, unfortunately, my personal WhatsApp. I got to literally see my great aunt buried on WhatsApp. She was 94, she lived through the Nakba, and she was displaced this last winter, and it was so cold, and she was in the back of a pickup truck with 20 people, she passed away. So yeah, I think that it's incredibly important. The Gazans are, again, they're the example of this. The dead are not going ungrieved in Gaza, and I think in these moments, ritual and faith are, we see the best of ritual and faith in these moments. I personally struggle a lot around faith in this time, but I also see how it's playing a really important role to a lot of Gazans. They are saying that they have no one but God. A lot of people are saying, like, God is the only one that's left for them. And you see people calling out to God in the, as they're uncovering their loved ones. They're saying, Hasbullah, like, God will account. So talking about accounting, I think that I think that you could also maybe see faith and the invocation of God and the collective grieving of people immediately. You'll see people in slings, you know, still bloody bandages circling to bid farewell to the people who were killed hours before. You know, Muslim funerals, you bury the body immediately. So there's this immediate sense of like the community coalescing to some sort of degree and saying goodbye, and children watching their parents buried. Like there's not this separation of like, you know, there's not the sanitation, there's not that option obviously, but yeah, I think that there's so much death in the midst of life in Gaza right now, and it's just, I think, a material parallel to honestly like the abstract reality that we're also in. Like we're in the midst of a state it's a necro state, you know, death is all around us here too. So I think that I don't want to ever say that Gaza is a metaphor or a theory, but Gaza can teach us a lot about, you know, in a lot of ways it feels like a physical manifestation of a lot of like abstract truths about other parts of the world. And like there's, like I said, there's like the barrier between us here and them there is so artificial, and a lot of the existence that we live here is made possible by the fact that there are Gazas and there are you know, other abandoned states and abject states all around the world, like the Congo, you know, other populations. They make our life possible, which means that our life is embedded with death. So yeah, unfortunately, I think that we've had a lot of opportunity to think about death, and that grieving that is a practice that we should make for ourselves, even if we're here, and even if we're not seeing literal bodies. That it makes me think a lot about the bodies that are involved in my day-to-day life. So, yeah, if that makes sense.
Okay, I have one more while people are thinking, and we can also like give you you know, a rest eventually, but so I was really intrigued by there was just like a passing line in your talk where you said some people would say like humanity, but I'm gonna say nature instead, and it seemed to me like in your writing, you again in that exchange of letters, you were talking about the worries about this like idea of humanity, and you just talked, you know, you spoke again today about, you know, not playing into the game of trying to, you know, like prove your humanity, or, you know, prove you're as human as others are, and that there's something sort of like suspect about that conception of humanity itself. And this is something that I've just been thinking about a little bit, also in the context of like environmental problems and the way that those things are sort of tied up together. You know, I was thinking of what's his name, the Israeli minister for war.
Go on.
Yeah, so he, you know, the you know, we're fighting human animals guy. And like the, you know, the initial understandable reaction is to come back and be like, you know, we're not animals, we're right? And that's, I think, both understandable and like plays into that dynamic that you're calling into question. So that's another thing where I'd be interested to, it was kind of subtext there, but I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about like what led you to that change in how you're talking about it.
Thanks. Yeah. It's maybe a subtext today, but it's like text most of the time in my life. I'm thinking about it a lot, and also in honestly in relation to the climate disaster, like that. Yeah. Before the like acceleration of this genocide in last year, like climate disaster was like the other thing that was just like crushing, and then I struggled to feel any sort of agency underneath. But I think that I think that I'm far from the first person to question like the idea of like universal humanism or like humanity being invoked, like the capital H humanity as like this thing we've arrived at that makes us so superior and moral, and we can like rest assured that certain lines will never be crossed. I think that, you know, the genius that's been applied to industrialized killing in Gaza, but for decades elsewhere as well, the carceral system, capitalism, like, I don't know, I'm pretty disgusted with the macro outcome of capitalism, humanity lately. I think that's like an appropriate sort of slip. So like human in the macro, you know, Dionne Brand talks about that. She says that it's a discredited idea. Isabel Hamad recently wrote about Edward Said and his past like writing on humanism and how he started to struggle with that at the end of his life, and she's also questioning it. So, and like Afro-pessimism talks a lot about this. So I'm still a student of this concept. It's just like, but it's also a gut reaction of like, what humanity are you talking about? The people who are walking, I mean, in Arabic, like everywhere, like, I mean, sorry, like in so many videos, you'll hear people saying like, "Wain al-insaniya," which is like literally like, where is the humanity? So that is a concept in Arabic. But I feel like English is currently like the most dangerous language to me. And so what's being said in English to me is like the most important to pay attention to. And so discourse, I mean, obviously European languages, and there's a lot of oppression and horrible violence perpetrated under other languages, but English here as like a stand-in for just like imperial and hegemonic power. So like my hegemonic language that or my imperial language that I speak is English. So anyway, all that to say, when English speakers invoke humanity, it's either usually in the context of trying to assert some sort of superiority over like, well, we, you know, have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We, in the West, we invented this United Nations system and this whole like system of international law. We're very proud about that, but we also are proving that we're very selective in how we apply it. So it's either like this sense of superiority, or it's people who are extremely well-meaning, but are placing a lot of trust in, I think, the Western system that speaks so much about humanity. So I'm really calling the system into question. I'm not saying that there can't be something that's defined in a different way called humanity that I believe in. And I think that, again, language always fails. Like we can call it any word and it won't be the perfect word to what we're kind of gesturing at. But like for me, nature just makes more sense. And like when I talked about Barghouti, he was saying, you know, the occupation is an affront to the sky and to the earth. And later he says, nothing is more powerful than the wall except birds, flies, and dust. Mm-hmm. So he's sort of saying like there's an earth and there's a nature that like precedes human cruelty and will exceed it. And I think that that's also some dark comfort to me when it comes to the environment too, is like the environment is, she's not doing great, but like she's gonna outlive a lot of our transgressions. And yeah, that's another topic, but they're related. So yeah, I guess I'm just calling to question the system that invokes like capital H humanity. And just, you know, as a writer, and thankfully not a politician, it's not my job to like give you a different system. It's more to just like be provocative and say, you know, a few years ago, maybe I wouldn't have had the framework to think that like there was something that humanity wasn't like the ultimate good to appeal to. Now it's like Dionne Brand says, it's a discredited idea. And right after that, she says like, this does not need a remedy, this does not need a balm, it needs an ending. So she's also just being a poet there. She's not saying, and here's the other thing that we're gonna do instead. She's just saying like, hey, do you see what I see? This is not working. And this is actually the exact opposite of what it's claiming to be. And I think it's an ongoing question. That's why I'm so glad I'm doing letters with someone else, because like, I don't know. I literally just want to ask questions. I could ask all of you what you think, but yeah.
Thank you. I have one question from Zoom, from Iman, who says, I want to ask more about her book, if she wants to talk about it. As someone who's followed her on social media for some time, I've been anticipating her debut since it was announced. So,
thanks, Iman. That's so nice. My book is coming out in April. I need to start learning how to talk about it, but I'm not very good at it yet. yeah, I guess I'll just say like something else that I was trying to do with that book is like reckon with like the danger of narrative in general, the danger of systems that present themselves as like whole and complete answers. So the book itself, like structurally, is really, I just try and play with structure a little bit to like call into question, because just like every structure I look at, I feel like I have a problem with these days. And like governments, capitalism, the way our language works to justify all those things. So the book's kind of experimental structurally for that reason. It's also experimental because it plays with ideas of time. Repetition is a nakba, so time in that book is very fluid, because I think that if we're honest, our experience of time is not linear at all. So it's a very non-linear book. It includes my grandmother's life before the Nakba, and then in Gaza, my father's life, my life. It calls into question a lot of the systems around, like other systems such as gender, and it's a very personal story. So yeah, it's a book I didn't ever want to write, but I realized I always needed to read, is kind of like how I would put it. So, and then it'll be out there, and maybe other people will read it. But yeah, and I really enjoyed writing it. I appreciate the question. Yeah. I know it's really heavy stuff, y'all.
Okay, I have a question, and it's based off of something you said during Moon's first question.
Uh-huh.
And you said that we have to make our writing hurt. And I'm curious if you have any advice on how to do that. Because you would think that in writing about a genocide, like, it would hurt for everybody. But that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of people who, like, will read something and still feel numb to it.
Yeah.
And you can use scathing language and, like, use your language to try to make it hurt. But I'm not sure if that convinces everyone either.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a great question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to any questions, by the way. I'm just thinking, I'm thinking towards you at every time you ask a question. So I'll try to think towards that. I love all of these questions, by the way. I really appreciate this group. It hurts. Well, I think that the answer isn't usually to just hit harder on the atrocity, it's not always a matter of scale. Actually, it might be a matter of scale, but in reverse. I think zeroing in and making things as granular as possible is often really effective. It's a fine line to walk, because it might veer towards sentimentality and like this, like demonstrating your humanity, tell a sad story about a mother and her kid. Like that's a very like familiar convention, right? But there's this idea, I mean, it's like, it's gonna be a sloppy quotation. Like I'm gonna invoke like Roland Barthes. He has this quotation, he's talking about photography, but he talks about this idea of this punctum. It's like this thing that punctures through, like you're just looking at a photo and there's just like one tiny detail that will just puncture you, and suddenly that photo is entering you and you're feeling something, and that's the power of the photograph, and it's this ineffable thing. And so I think about the punctum a lot when I'm writing. Again, that might be someone who's like a Barthes scholar might be like, you're misapplying that. But for me, it's just like a useful idea of like, what punctures me? So like, it goes back to what I was saying, like how we move through this genocide or any moment as human beings, I think is like where our answer to these like aesthetic questions will come from, or at least for me. So I have days when I'm numb and I like really have to be honest. And I'm like, you know, sometimes people ask me how I'm doing. I'm like, I'm totally dissociated today. I don't want to stay here, but some days I'm so exhausted, and in those days I trust that like someone else is gonna write something today. But in general, I try to stay alive to my feelings and like let those guide me, because I think that somewhat cliche thing I heard in journalism school is like one writer said that she said, I only write the stories that only I can write, which is, again, it sounds a little cliche, but it always stuck with me of like, what is the thing I have to say? And it's much more effective, I feel, to start there than to say like, what effect do I want to have? How do I make that effect happen? I want to shake people up. I want to hurt them. Because I know I just said my writing should hurt, but I guess I came upon that in reverse of like trying to write inside of the place where I was hurting. And then the writing that came out of that, I feel like was writing that was had more to offer than I just need people to wake up, because that's how I feel all the time. But I also know that if it were that simple of just, some people actually, I meet them every once in a while, they just read a UN report and they are radicalized. But for most people, especially nowadays, it's a little more complicated. So yeah, I try to find where I'm hurting and write from there, and not sanitize the language and stay away from conventions. I think that I try and bend language a little bit and make it a little strange, because that also, I think, like grates people's ears and maybe will cause somebody to pay attention a little more. And the last thing I'll say is just like make your art as good as you possibly can, because like that's super important. And the world needs it. That's a cheesy thing to say. I'm not gonna say that, but just just be as badass as you possibly can, because that's political and that's good. And that's where I would probably start to answer your question. I hope that made some sense. I ask it every day, probably. Thank you.
I'll just give people an opportunity for any closing questions.
I guess this was a little bit redundant, but in terms, you talk a lot about like witnessing and like talk a lot about like the futility in it, especially like on our side of the field, how there's like very voyeuristic consumption of a lot of like the oversaturated media that we see nowadays. How do you like, I guess, get collective agency amongst people when you have that kind of effect happening, especially when like witnessing maybe also kind of brings to light like the failures of the systems and like kind of ways things are today.
Yeah.
Like how do you kind of push towards a better future? How do you see maybe a collective way for all of us to move forward in a better way?
These questions just keep getting better and harder. No, that's a really good question. I would love to know what anyone else in the room thinks about that. But what I think that maybe the most important thing I could offer to that today, because I'm always trying to think further, but where does the futility come from? Who's making it? Like, who's taking the agency that we don't feel? Who took it? Like, I think that when we see voyeuristic looking, we should turn the looking back and ask, like, what is the audience seeking? When we feel helplessness, we should turn that sense of helplessness outward and say, who's making us helpless? Like, we're actually not helpless, but there are so many layers of force, direct and indirect, that are trying to make it so that we can't stop this genocide or stop climate change. Like, I think that if anything of value is to be gained from this thing that should have never happened, this genocide, it is the absolute irreversible loss of faith in our current systems. So whether it's like the governments that we're under, or the rhetoric that we've been taught to use, or even just the simple idea that like sharing evidence of like crimes will like cause the crimes to be put to an end. Like, if all of those things, like if our faith in all of those concepts can be shaken, that's like a devastating place to be, but it doesn't have to be where it stops. It can be the place where we start to ask questions. And like, what I'm really talking about is like revolution, which is a big word and a big idea and like a lot of work, and like can feel like just like adding another layer of like, oh my God, this is an unbearable time to live in. But just like the idea of human, I could have never thought past the idea of human a few years ago. Like, what else are we not thinking past right now that we could? And that can be a source of like oblique kind of hope, because as much as it feels like all of us are helpless and like 5 people in the world have decided that the slaughter is going to continue, that's like literally what it is. But like flip that, like if there's 5 people standing between us and like ending the genocide, we need to not lose sight of the fact that there literally have been millions of people in the streets over the last year. It's been devastating to watch that not translate, but also there have been millions of people in the streets. And as someone who's been Palestinian her whole life, and had to tell people what Palestine was most of my life. Like, that's not the case anymore, for better and worse. Clearly, it's from there's horrible reason behind that, but because we can't reverse that, let's just ask, like, if we're being devastated by this moment, like, what can we devastate? Can we devastate the systems that are causing this? Like, what can we flip, I guess, is my answer. But that's a really good question.
Yeah.
Good luck. You're the future, y'all. Young people.
I have one last one from Zoom. This is also from Iman, who says, I'm in the early process of doing my dissertation around imperial feminism, especially in the context of this genocide. What would you recommend to look into, research, or question on that topic?
Ooh.
If you have thoughts about it.
Yeah, I mean, if someone's doing their dissertation on it, they probably know more than me, but I mean, that's like just talking about questioning systems that we take for granted, like feminism. There's a lot of different feminisms.
Yeah.
Feminism was used to justify interventions in Afghanistan, in the Middle East. Yeah, there's a lot of weaponized feminism and white feminism. There's a book that came out a couple of years ago. It's not, the most radical book, but it's like a very good like groundwork. If you like haven't read it, it's called Against White Feminism. So it's a good, or just researching like the different histories of feminisms, even in the US, the different waves of feminism, the embedded racism there, the way that femininity and white femininity has been weaponized during the process of colonization, and the way that that's been flipped to justify subjugation of men of color and women of color, people of color. Yeah, that sounds like a super interesting dissertation, and I think that they probably already know more than me about the subject, but I'm here for it. I think there should be more written on it for sure.
We can stop, but this just reminded me of I was at a panel recently that was like asking this question in the context of Palestine, and there's a philosopher named Alia Al-Saji, who writes a lot about like colonial time, but her paper was fantastic, and she was thinking about like not just the ways in which the discourse of feminism is weaponized in selective ways in terms of like which forms of sexual violence are we looking at or whatever, but also kind of like the insidious way that like it's sort of weaponized against Palestinian men in some cases, right? Where we're always sort of like talking about, it's the women and children, right?
Yeah.
And there's this sort of just presumption of guilt that goes along gender lines there. So yeah, I think there's a lot to dig into and unpack there.
Yeah.
So we'll look forward to hearing from you on
Yeah.
in the future also.
No, that's a good point. The expose about the New York Times like piece. Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Screams Without Words. If y'all didn't hear about that whole controversy, basically the way that sexual violence surely did occur on October 7th, but it was like vastly misconstrued and like extremely journalistically bankrupt the way that New York Times reported on it. So that's just an example of a double standard and a weaponization that was like incredibly in bad faith. Obviously, believe women and all people, but it's really good to look closer, especially when the people being identified as perpetrators are people of color and the victims are white. Just look again, just to be sure.
Yeah.
It's good reminder. But yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was heavy. Thank you for being here.
We really appreciate you taking the time.
No, it's great. No, thank you so much. Thank you for bearing with me and for all your questions. It seems like a super interesting symposium, and I wish I could hear all of the discussions and conclusions y'all are coming to. Are you all in the same major or critical visual?
I think everybody here is, right?
Yeah? Amazing, wow, wow. Super interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for being
You guys are
here.
cool students.
No wonder you're so thoughtful, that's amazing, yeah.
Lots of people saying thank you, fantastic.
Thank you.
Lots of gratitude on Zoom also.
Oh, great, thank you, Zoom, thank you. What a world.
Yeah.
That was so nice.
For your
Thank you
talk.
for having me.
Also your necklace.